Welcome to episode 14 of the RX8 build. We have made a ton of progress. Right, why have I cut out a piece of ice lolly box and stuck it to the firewall? Well, if you come to the inside of the car, it makes a whole load more sense. If we peer into the footwell on the driver's side, you can see we've got the steering column bushing box thing, I don't know what you'd call that, all bolted back up, which is great. But what we need is somewhere to run two brake lines, front and rear, before they then split off to left and right, and the line for the gearbox. We need to run them from down here where our pedal box is going to bolt in, obviously out to the engine bay. And I think the best way to do it is through the hole that we've already got for the old brake pedal. It's perfect size. We can easily get the three lines through there, no problem at all. And we've got four holes that we can put bolts through, and we can make a template just bolted onto the firewall. So you can see on the inside here, I've stuck the cardboard on and just gone round with a pen, so I know exactly where to drill my holes, make sure we don't go outside the lines. So all we've got to do now is cut him out of steel, give him a quick paint and drill some holes. With the part now cut out in steel, the template allows us to mark up where we need to drill our holes so that we can bolt it into the existing bracket for the brake pedal in the firewall, but also it gives us a guide as to where we can drill our holes to fit these guys. That's better. These are bulkhead fittings for the brake lines, and while the threaded part is reasonably small, the nut, as you can see, is bigger, obviously. So we need to make sure that we don't drill our holes so close to the edge that we don't have space to do our nuts up. On the outside, that's totally fine. We've got all of this space to play with. On the inside of the car, where the brake pedal actually used to attach, obviously there's a ring of metal, and then there's these bits that stick up for the bolts. So we need to be nicely inside this circle and enough space to do our nuts up. So apart from not having quite the right size bolts to bolt this guy in, it's just in temporarily at the minute, that is done. You can see while we mess around in the engine bay, I've just put these guys on so we don't mess up the threads. But basically, when we flare our lines, they come from here and then we can work them across. Now, we can't get in and do all our holes and P-clips with the engine in the way, so we're going to take him out again. The next piece of the puzzle is this guy. This is our sort of four-way T-piece, and he is going to come up like that. That is going to allow us to connect from our, can't see my hands in the way, bulkhead fitting in, out, and then across to the passenger side, down to the driver's side, and then we have a spare one for our hydraulic brake light switch. So the next thing to do is drill a hole, get this guy mounted, and then we can start measuring pipe. There we go, perfect. Now with this in, nice and solid, and that, we can now start on the copper lines. So the first one we're going to do is from here to the in of our T-piece here. So it's a nice short one, so we can practice with our pipe bender. This is our brake flaring tool, and we've got just a cheap pipe bender. Now, brake flaring tools range in cost from something like this, which is about 25 quid I think, all the way up to a couple of £100. They bolt into a vise and all sorts of stuff. These are a little fiddlier and they probably don't flare the pipes quite as nicely, but I've used this a number of times. I use this on my kit car, on various other projects, and it's never failed. It's always made a seal, it's never leaked, so I'm pretty happy with it. It does the job. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to, if we can focus, we're going to start. Oh, come on now. No? What? I'm going to give up here. Right, I've given up trying to film pipe outside, and we've moved indoors just while we film this little bit. So, there is 3 types of flares on the end of the pipe that we can make with the kit that we have. We've got just a standard, don't you dare. No, thank you. Standard single flare. We've got a double flare and what's called a bubble flare. So I will show you those now and then talk through which ones we are using. The single flare is achieved just by putting the pipe into the flaring tool, and you put it in flush, as you can see, with the top, and you use the side that has the recess. The other side, as you can see, is flat. So we start like that. You then clamp down really tight both sides, because you don't want the pipe slipping. You can see inside, if it'll focus, that these grooves grip onto the pipe, but only if you do the clamps up tight enough. You then slip this part of the tool over the whole assembly and position, if we can get him to focus, this part right in the centre of the pipe and crank him down. It doesn't have to be stupid tight, but you want it fairly snug, and you can see that it flares the pipe out. And you back this guy up. This camera cannot keep up with what we're doing. Slide him off, and you can see, I'm sorry camera, that we have flared the end of the pipe. Right, let me grab a fitting and I'll show you how this works. Now, there's loads of different types of brake pipe fittings. This end piece at least is almost exactly what we've got on our bulkhead fitting, so this is a good example. And you can see with the pipe flared, if we look what we're doing, that would sit there, and then the fitting on the other side would tighten up, and as you screw this together, it squeezes the pipe against the fitting, so you end up with a fluid type seal across there. Now, these flares, these single ones, are generally only good for low pressure applications. So in terms of our brake lines, which are all, well, certainly high pressure from our pedal box down to our calipers, this single flare is no good for us. We need a double flare, which we'll do now. To create our double flare, first we need to make a bubble flare. And we do that this time not by putting the pipe in flat, but we need them sticking out slightly. And the way we judge the depth of the pipe is with these little formers. The kit comes with a number of different sized formers, if we move that way, for different sized pipes. So for the brake pipe that we're using this size. You can see he sits in there nice and snug. So we use this guy, the back half, to measure the depth of our pipe. So that's how we start. Just like with the standard single flare, we then take the other part of the kit, but rather than this pointed piece going directly into the pipe, it sits in. See, the little formers have a little groove on the top and the point sits in there. And then just like we did before, we crank this guy down until the former in the pipe is flat. Come on, camera. Is flat against the clamp. So we're nearly there. Like that. Right, we'll undo him. And then when we take this guy out, you can see that we've basically folded the pipe back in on itself. Now we go back to the tool without the former. So we go back to our flaring tool, and as we crank this guy down, we are now flaring not one but 2 layers of pipe where we've folded it back in on itself. So again, doesn't have to be crazy tight, but you want it to really snug down nicely. And then loosen this guy up. And there, oh, so close. There we go. We have flared out the double thickness pipe. Now, just like the single flare, the double flare will sit against our fittings like that, and then the other piece goes down and clamps it, except that when we tighten down the second piece of the fitting, we are clamping 2 layers of copper pipe, not 1. This is obviously far stronger and is exactly what is needed for the high pressure lines. This is the type of flare that's used by manufacturers for all the high pressure lines, and it is exactly what we're going to be using on all the pipes that we're making. So we are going with the double flare. The bubble flare, by the way, is simply this flare, but without this guy. So you use the former, like we did, with the, well, you can use the flat side actually if you're not going to flare it out at the end. Again, you measure your pipe up with your former, do the forming part, and then just leave it. And there are some fittings that accept that type of flare, but almost everything that we've got on our car, all of our bulkhead fittings, the Goodrich lines, are all like this. So I've now got to do, I don't know how many more of these. It's a lot anyway. So I'm going to get busy and make some more double flares, and once we've got some progress, I'll update you. Even though we're replacing all of the brake lines, including these flexi ones, which we'll see in a moment, there's a couple of little bits that we do actually need to keep from the original system. The first is this bracket. This bolts to the subframe and has a cutout to hold in the top part. Oh, focus, it's not going to. Top part of the flexi. And the other thing we need is this retaining clip. So the flexi goes through the hole, and then it clips up to keep him in place, and then you bolt your hard line to the top. But clearly they can't go back on the car looking like this because they are nasty, so they're going to get some wire wheel and a bit of paint treatment before we put them on, and then we'll get back to our lines. With the brake line bent and P-clipped all the way up to this point, there's a P-clip just on the other side, on the inside of the engine bay, and actually if we look at the opposite side, you can see that's what that guy looks like there, finished. So we're doing the same on this side. So we've got him all P-clipped up, and I've bent it just roughly and put the bracket in place. And what I've done is held up the flexi line to see roughly where the end of this pipe, once flared, is going to sit inside this bracket. Now when you're cutting these pipes, you want them slightly too long rather than slightly too short. If they're a bit too long, you can bend the pipe and sort of make it shorter, run it on a longer route as it were. If it's slightly too short, you can't stretch it. So err on the side of caution and go a little bit too long. And that is what it looks like with all of the front brake lines finished. and of course the engine is back in. It's neat. I'm really chuffed. I think we've done a good job. You can see that we've just laid the clutch line over. It's attached to the gearbox, and all the lines run down there nice and neat. And although they're a reasonable distance away from the exhaust, you can't really see down in that corner, but they're all heat wrapped as well. So err on the side of caution, nice and safe. Now, obviously you can see the engine is back in the car, and it is bolted to the gearbox with its brand new clutch and flywheel. It's in, and fingers crossed, it's staying in. And that is what I will share with you next.